St. Louis, and I thank you, Chairman Cohen, for convening this important hearing. And want to say thank you to the leadership of Representative Sheila Jackson Lee on this. I really appreciate you. Um, I come as one, but I speak as many. I bring with me today my family, James E. Bush, Vera Bush Whitley, Ulysses Blakeney, Clifton Blakeney, and generations of Black men and women who have labored on this land, who have fought for this country, and to whom our country is deeply indebted. My story is a story of survival. It is a story of my ancestors who were enslaved in Mississippi and South Carolina. It is a story of the Great Migration, the mass migration of 6 million African Americans out of the rural South. When white farmers traveled to the West in search of land, they were granted 160 acres of free land through the Homestead Act. My family was denied the promise of 40 acres and a mule in the aftermath of the Civil War and the start of Reconstruction. My story is the story of a great grandfather who served this country in World War I and a grandfather who served this country in World War II, only to be discarded by their government as they suffered through trauma and the wounds of war. When white soldiers came back from fighting abroad, they were given housing preferences and education subsidies. My grandfathers, Ulysses and Clifton Blakeney, were denied those benefits. My story is a story of men and women who fled violence, who were stripped of their rights and protections, who were left out of GI bills and New Deal subsidies. The violence my family withstood from one generation to the next was not isolated. It was systemic, it was structural, it was political, backed by legislation passed by this very body to deny descendants of enslaved people economic and social opportunity. Underlying the generational trauma and exploitation is a government that abandoned its role to protect its own citizens, a government that refused to even acknowledge the humanity of my ancestors, a government that to this day refuses to acknowledge or atone for the wrongdoings of white supremacist violence. The federal government must account for its ongoing role in perpetuating, supporting, and upholding white supremacy. Secretary Weber, as you mentioned, state governments and in some instances, private institutions unjustly profited from the unpaid labor of descendants of enslaved people. Why is it still necessary for the federal government to play a central role in restoring the harm of slavery and its aftermath? And what can the federal government learn from states' efforts?
Well, clearly, the federal government oftentimes protects the laws in the various states that have been put forth. You have the ultimate authority to determine the legality and of issues that are there. So oftentimes we appeal to the federal courts and obviously have those courts reject the issues and therefore perpetuate the kind of injustices that do continue to exist. The federal government has a significant role. The laws that were created in this land and endorsed by the Supreme Court, the separate but equal laws, all of those things actually enforce the kind of treatment and racism that exists. The refusal to basically try individuals who had engaged in lynching in this country, the violation of people's human rights. You have whole books with pictures of people who lynched individuals face forward, looking at you, knowing who they were, and no one has ever been tried for any of the lynchings found in the books that we have, enormous books on Without Sanctuary, where every example is an example of lynching that occurred face forward, where people took pride and made postcards out of lynching that existed. And as a result, no one has ever been tried for any of those lynchings that were there. And of course, so when we look at it, the federal government has a significant role to play. We hope that when we look at the things that are there, like the insurance industry is regulated by the federal government, it's regulated by states, but also by the federal government. And so it condones the behavior and the discriminatory practices that existed in the various states. We hope in California to be able to demonstrate not only an ability to look at the injustices, to see what has occurred, but also to fashion a response to it that is deeper and long term. And as pointed out, we've never talked about money, but obviously money is in everything. And it's not about giving money. It's about making sure that the programs that exist basically can effectively address this long-standing situation that has been in African American life. And so the federal government has a significant role to play. And we hope in the state that we will do our part as a state, as a large state with resources to begin to address the issue. But others should also be looking carefully at themselves. And surely that we hope that the federal government will support the efforts and the recommendations we make concerning what a state should do, and maybe even what the role the federal government should play in assisting the state in accomplishing its goals.
That's my time. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.